Okay, here we are, ladies and gentlemen, back again for our second segment today. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to conclude our discussion of the basic requirements for the course. And so we have been talking about the journal, we've been talking about the term paper, and now let's talk about the final examination. And Scott, if we can go to the screen here, please. Let's see, are we going to get the PowerPoint? There we are. Thank you. The final examination is obviously going to focus on major points about the works discussed in class. I will not ask you about anything that we do not cover and cover in detail in class. Okay? Secondly, the questions on the final examination will be based on questions presented during the review for the final examination in the last segment of the course. In other words, in the last segment of the course, I am going to give you a list of study questions for the final. I will go over each one of those questions in detail, and I will explain to you what each question is asking for, what it's asking you to do, what kind of information I want you to provide in response to a given question. So we'll not only be talking about the questions, but we will be talking about the kinds of things that will count as successful answers to each one of these questions. These are all going to be things that come right out of the class discussions during the course. The question on Hamlet will be obligatory, and that's something that we will be discussing for 3 different segments coming up when we get to the talking about Hamlet. Okay? So I won't go into that in great detail right now, but it will be based at least in part on your having viewed a film production of Hamlet. So, during the examination, you may use your textbook, but no other materials or notes. In other words, bring your textbook in. You know, and if you want to consult your textbook while you're writing in a response to a question, fine. Students sometimes say, well, can I take notes as I'm reading in the textbook? Of course you can. I mean, that's what a textbook is for, isn't it? You know, don't you always read with a pencil or a pen in your hand? I mean, that's what reading is. So that you can star things that are important items, or you can write little comments in response to what the author has just said. Questions that you may have at a certain point in reading a text. You know, when my children were small, I used to open up my books on Chaucer or Milton or Shakespeare or whatever, you know, and I would find right in the middle of the Canterbury Tales, here would be some great big scrawl with an orange crayon. Well, I couldn't really get after them because, after all, that's what you do with books, right? You write in books. I mean, that's what they saw me do every single day. So anyway, yes, if you want to take notes as you're reading along, that's a way of reading, of very attentively reading. Reading is not just a passive exercise where you're just going to sit back and go, oh, well, yeah, all right, you know. Reading is something that you should be very actively engaged in. What's going on here? Who's doing the talking? What kinds of questions do you have as you're reading along? And the more active you become in responding to what you're reading, the more what you read will become, and your thinking about it will become imprinted in your brain. There's actually some very interesting psychological evidence, especially gathered by some British psychologists, cognitive psychologists, that If you not only listen to something or read something, but you also write, like taking notes in class, what happens is that the thinking process engages yet another part of the brain, which is highly significant in terms of your understanding and your retention of certain kinds of ideas, information, and so forth. It's one of the reasons why, if you go to a business meeting, you will very often see people bringing pads and they're taking notes. That's not just to have a record of what was said, just like taking notes in class is not simply to have a record of what was said. Taking notes in class is a way of engaging in the material and in the ideas, because notice what's happening. If I'm talking and you're taking notes on something that I say, what's happening is it's passing through your consciousness in such a way that you are now putting that, at least in large part, into your own words. In other words, you are engaging a mental process in the very activity of writing down your notes. And that's really the primary reason for taking notes, at least as far as I'm concerned. In any event, yes, you can take notes in your textbook. And yes, you are permitted to use your textbook during the final examination. So if you're writing about Chaucer, say, and you're a little hazy on, well, now wait a second, what was the name of that character in The Miller's Tale? You know, oh yeah, Nicholas. I mean, if you want to look it up, fine. Fine. I mean, all of us do that, don't we? I mean, don't you sometimes block on somebody's name? Somebody whom you think you know very well, and you think, oh my God, why didn't I remember her name? You know, so it's so embarrassing. Well, you can do that in a final exam, can't you? So you've got that there as an aid, if you wish. And so I say only that I ask you not to bring other materials or notes. Any other books, notes, you know, that kind of stuff. Okay? Is that all clear? But the questions on the final examination are going to be questions that you will have in advance and that we will have discussed in class in advance of the final examination. Okay? And we can talk more about that when we get closer to the final, because it will make more sense when I talk about some questions, you know, if we've actually gone over the materials. And something that everybody always wants to know about, well, how is the final grade determined? Well, in general, this is how it's determined. That 10% is devoted to the journals. That's why it's important for you to turn those journals in. That's why it's important, if you get behind, for you simply to catch up and get your journals in that you're a little bit late with, okay? Because 10% of your grade can make the difference between one letter and another. It happens every single semester. I'll be going through the materials to make out the final grades, and I'll have somebody who did a terrific job on the term paper and a terrific job on the paper, and for some reason or another the person hasn't turned in the journals, or only turned in one. That could make the difference between maybe like an A and a B plus, say. Okay, so which is significant in terms of your record, and it's also significant in terms of your overall grade point average, which I know is important to many of you, because many of you will, whether you are thinking about this right now or not, many of you will probably go to a graduate or professional school. And so these things do matter. Okay, so the final grade will be based on the term paper at roughly 45%, the final roughly 45%. In other words, those are of equal weighting, and then roughly 10% for the journals. And again, remember, the journals are so easy to do. You're writing up a page, and these are your personal responses. There's no way to get this wrong. There's no way to get this wrong, because they're your personal responses to the material. And after all, your personal responses are your personal responses, right? Okay. Any questions about anything that I have just said? About the final or about the grading? Notice when I say things about, well, it's going to be, in general, 45% for this, and, you know, et cetera. The reason why I don't hold myself to an absolutely precise numerical breakdown is that I reserve the right to exercise some flexibility. When I exercise that flexibility, it's always to your advantage, by the way, never to your disadvantage. I mean, if somebody really does an absolutely outstanding job on the final and has done a good paper, you know, I may give the person an extra little bump up, you know, for having done such an outstanding job on the final, let's say. So that's why I give you these as approximations of the way in which generally I weight things in the course. Okay? Any questions? Questions? All right. Well, let's go on. And let's actually begin the material of the course. I'm not going to talk here about the prehistory of Britain, though that's very interesting, by the way. And archaeologists have done a very great deal in establishing all kinds of interesting information about the prehistory of Britain. By the prehistory of Britain, I mean, if you go back to things like Stonehenge, say. Stonehenge was done in its present form somewhere around 2500 BC or BCE, as we now say. You'll notice, by the way, that not only I, but also many historians, literary scholars, and so forth, don't use the terms AD and BC any longer so much as they use BCE, before the Common Era, and CE for the Common Era. So it's basically the same thing that we've always done, except that the designations are a little bit different. So roughly, what would that be? About 4,500 years ago, we have Stonehenge being put together in more or less its present form, though we know that it was tinkered on and changed in some ways along the way. And there are all kinds of other very interesting archaeological finds from a prehistoric period, not only in England proper, but also in Wales and Scotland and Ireland. I mean, my God, look at Ireland with all of those wonderful prehistoric monuments all over the landscape, to say nothing of some of the great burial mounds and tombs and so forth that go back even farther than Stonehenge. So we could talk about those things, but if we did, we would spend much of our time simply discussing the prehistory of England, and that's a very, very interesting topic in itself. But by the time the peoples of Britain begin to enter into history in terms of actually being recorded in written documents, is during the period in which the Romans are beginning to encounter them. And the Romans first launch an expedition under Julius Caesar in the 60s. This is before our era, BC or BCE. And this is really a kind of military expedition that never intended to take over the island. But what the Romans did typically was they would call a whole people by the name of the one tribe or group whom they encountered either first or most often or had the most significant contacts with. And the tribal group that they had the most significant contacts with were the Britons. And so they called everybody Britons. But on the other hand, there were lots of different tribal groupings all over the British Isles. And so Caesar's military adventures into Britain were short-lived, and he had other fish to fry on the continent, as you may know, including trying to get himself established as emperor. And so he did not pursue this military adventure very long. And so it wasn't really until the time of the Emperor Claudius, and this is in the 4th decade of our era. This is in the 30s. Under the Emperor Claudius, whom some of you may know from that wonderful, well, it's a pair of books by Robert Graves, but it was made into a wonderful PBS miniseries called I, Claudius a few years ago. If you haven't seen it, it's terrific stuff. In any event, Claudius became emperor, and Claudius was not very highly thought of by the people around him in important, prestigious places in Rome at the time. But Claudius was actually very smart and a very bright politician. And he knew that if he could order and in large part carry out the conquest of Britain for Rome, that he would have accomplished something that even Julius Caesar had not been able to do. And so he sent the Roman legions northward, and they did indeed conquer Britain. And so Britain became Britannia, which was a province of the Roman Empire, in which the Romans got fairly far northward into what is now Scotland, though they didn't take over all of Scotland. And they got even out into Wales to a certain extent, but they didn't take over all of Wales. It used to be thought, until about 3 years ago, that the Romans never got over to Ireland. But there's an absolutely extraordinary archaeological find that was unearthed about 3 years ago, as I say, by some archaeologists who discovered a very large Roman army encampment in the more or less northern, not far north, but more or less northern part of Ireland. We don't know whether that was unique in the sense that it was the only one. We don't know how long it lasted. Those kinds of archaeological investigations will have to continue, and probably we will know more within the next decade or two about that sort of thing. You know, what kind of Roman presence there may have been or not in Ireland in ancient times. But in any event, even if the Romans did establish a kind of outer encampment in Ireland, they never really got into the interior of Ireland. So, in other words, most of the province of Britannia was confined to what we now consider to be the borders of England, for the most part, not quite, but for the most part. And this was a very, very prosperous province. It was also, because of its good weather, generally speaking, it was a place that people liked to go and take their vacations. Romans, prominent Romans and well-off Romans, and there were great manor houses, Roman manor houses, some of the remains of which can still be discovered by archaeologists. There were large farms, and a great deal of agriculture, very wealthy agriculture being produced in the province of Britannia. And in general, things went very well for the Romans, and it would appear in general for the Britons, who were a Celtic people. Did you hear what I just said, that they were a Celtic people? The Britons were the indigenous people of Britain before the Romans came were Celts. Now, let me just pause and say something about the Celts. And then I'm going to come back and continue the story about the Romans and the Britons and the relations between the two in early times in England, because this is all leading up to establishing the framework for where we begin our study of English cultural history. The Celtic peoples were first recognized as a distinct people by the Greeks, who called them Keltoi. And the so-called Keltoi extended from roughly the westernmost parts of what is now Russia, all the way across, going in an easterly direction, all the way across Europe, over into the British Isles, including, obviously, England, and then over into Ireland. They got southward to the area just to the north of Italy, much of what is now France, and down into the northern parts of Spain, so that you can still find Celtic artifacts and paintings and so forth on walls in Spain, which is very interesting. And then they were northward up to about where Austria and the northern part of France would be today. So that if you get an idea of what I'm just saying here, it's roughly in the large middle area of Europe, extending from east to west. Archaeological digs carried out, or excavations carried out in Switzerland and in Austria, indicate a very, very highly developed culture at a very early time, producing all kinds of very interesting artifacts, especially golden ornamentation, which is very sophisticated. And you can view this now in an exhibition in the National Museum of Ireland in Dublin. And you can probably get some of this online, images of it online. The exhibit went on tour to the United States, but unfortunately didn't get this far west. It got only to New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, probably because there are lots of concentrations of Irish Americans in those cities, but unfortunately it didn't get this far west and south. But in any event, you can view it. There are books which have pictures of these artifacts, and they're just absolutely splendid, absolutely splendid. Well, in any event, the Celts were the first peoples whom the Romans and the Greeks came into contact with north of themselves. Even in very ancient times, in the 4th century BC or BCE, the Celts even came down into the Italian peninsula and sacked Rome. But they didn't stay, because that was not really what they were interested in. And they went back up to their homeland, to the north. When Caesar later on talks about fighting against the Gauls, some of you may have studied this at one time or another. Julius Caesar actually wrote these accounts of his military expeditions in what was called Gaul, G-A-U-L. Well, Gaul is roughly modern France. Not exactly, but roughly modern France. And Julius Caesar marched with his legions up into Gaul and defeated an enormously numerically superior force of Celts who were in a loose alliance with one another. But both the advantage and the disadvantage of Celtic society came to the fore at this time. The Celts were very much in favor of local and home rule, which meant that they resisted centralized or highly centralized government. And that was fine for ordinary, everyday business dealings and whatnot. But it was not fine at a time of national catastrophe, such as the invasion of a foreign army. Their unwillingness to follow some centralized authority just didn't work very well when it came to doing battle against the Romans, who were highly disciplined and whose legions depended on a kind of centralizing of authority at every rank and at every level within the legions. So Caesar won, and Caesar was able to take over in Gaul. Well, he overran the Celts, and so many of them obviously just stayed where they were and became Romans along the way. Some were driven farther and farther to the west, to what is now Brittany. The reason why it's called Brittany is for the obvious reason that it was settled by those people from Britain who were also Celts. And Brittany, for those of you who may be a little hazy on your French geography, is the province of France that is just south of Normandy. Most Americans know where Normandy is. It's just to the south of that, across the English Channel from England, which of course provided the means by which these people would travel back and forth between Brittany and France and Britain, which now is England. Okay, so some of them, of course, went over into what is now England, and obviously up into Scotland, and over into Wales, and over into Ireland. And so there was this whole Celtic culture, which then became partly absorbed and partly involved in some kinds of cultural accommodations and the creation of new kinds of cultures in the areas where the Romans took over. Let me talk about Britain. The indigenous people then are Celts. The Romans come in, they conquer what is now England, and they become the ruling class. But very quickly, they start intermarrying with the native or indigenous peoples, the Celts, forming a whole new group known as the Romano-Celts. And so relations are, in general, more or less peaceable. Now, there are some exceptions. There were some Celtic uprisings in the early period of Roman conquest, the most important of which was led by Boudicca. Some of you may have heard of Boudicca. Anybody here heard of Boudicca? B-O-U-D-I-C-A-A. B-O-U-D-I-C-A-A. Boudicca was a queen. Her husband, a king, a tribal king, was killed. This is during these wars that were going on still in the early days of Roman conquest. Her husband was killed, and so she became the leader of this particular tribal grouping. And she thought that maybe she could make some accommodation with the Romans, a political accommodation, but the Romans were having none of it. At least these particular Romans were having nothing of it. And they not only raped her, but raped her daughters, her young daughters, in public, by the way. And this was not true of all Romans, and it was not a common Roman practice. But in this case, you know, these atrocities actually occurred. Well, Boudicca went and actually raised her standard and raised an army and actually defeated the Roman legions in a number of very, very important battles until, you know, she was finally, in this rebellion, as the Romans called it, was finally put down. And so, of course, she is remembered as not only a great woman warrior figure, but also one of the great resistors of Roman power in this time. Just like the Jews in Jerusalem, you know, it's roughly the same period. But what happened eventually was that the Romans more or less pacified Britannia, so that the indigenous peoples and the Romans appear, to all accounts, though most of the accounts are Roman accounts, I must say, to have been relatively peaceful. However, Rome itself was eventually going to have its borders in the east and the northeast in particular challenged by people who were coming out of Asia. The most important of these, the best known of these, of course, are the Huns. But there were lots of other such groups. And these were people who came across the northernmost part of Europe, and they came to be known collectively by the Germans, by the Romans, as the Germans, because they all spoke some version of a language which linguists would recognize as a common Germanic tongue with different dialects, just like English has lots of different dialects, right? So also would German have lots of different dialects. So the Romans were having their borders challenged more and more during the 4th and then finally in the 5th centuries by these people coming into the perimeter of the empire, some of them even being allowed inside the borders of the Roman Empire on pledges that they would be peaceful citizens of Rome, and so on and so on. Many of these were enlisted in the Roman legions themselves, by the way. And so as Rome was having more and more trouble in the east and the north, eventually they withdrew in or around 410 of our era, AD or CE. The Romans, the last Roman legions were ordered by the Emperor Honorius to withdraw from Britain, and they did so. Well, that left Britain unprotected. I mean, up to that point, they had the Roman army to protect them from any outside enemies, invaders, and so forth. There had been one coalition in the 4th century of Irish and Scots and Scandinavian Vikings who were coming into the northern part of England and actually tried to invade it and take it over. And the Romans eventually were able to defeat them after many, many difficulties. And so Rome was constantly beset by either by invaders or by the possibility of invaders. And one of the reasons for establishing Hadrian's Wall, the remains of which still exist in the northern part of England, separating England from Scotland, with this wall that goes right across from sea to sea in the northern part of England there. One of the reasons for that was apparently as a defensive position to keep the people who were known as the Picts up there in Pictland, which is now Scotland. It happens that the Scots were originally from Ireland. The word Scoti in Latin, or Scotti in Latin, was the name that the Romans used to describe the peoples of Ireland. They migrated at an early time over into the western parts of Scotland. They encountered there the Picts, P-I-C-T-S, the Picts. The Latin name for the Picts is the Picti, which is a word that gives us our word picture. These were the painted peoples. And the Romans described them as the Picti, or painted people, because the warriors would engage in warfare apparently naked, as Celtic warriors did in many places, by the way, fight naked. It was considered as some North American Indian tribes did too. It was considered to be a sign of your bravery that you would not wear any protective covering when you went into battle for some of these early peoples. But they would paint themselves blue or other colors. And so the Romans referred to these people collectively as the Picti, the painted ones, who would come storming down into the north of Britannia. Well, the Romans built this wall known as Hadrian's Wall after the Emperor Hadrian as a defensive position against the Picts and increasingly the Scoti from Ireland, who were settled now in the western part of Scotland. Well, after the Roman legions were withdrawn in 410, there no longer were soldiers to man the walls or to fight against these invading people. And so the Picts and the Scots are pouring down over Hadrian's Wall into the north of England. What happened was that there was sometime around the middle of the 5th century, the historian Bede gives the date 449, though that's probably not a very exact date. But anyway, he gives the traditional date of 449, when the Celts, the remaining Romans, and Romano-Celts in Britain invited from Germany, essentially, the German-speaking areas, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes to come over as mercenaries and fight on their behalf to help them hold off the Picts and Scots and whatnot, Irish and so forth. These people who came to be known as the Anglo-Saxons, that is to say, the Saxons who were in England. These, starting around the middle of the 5th century, or possibly a little bit earlier, according to recent archaeological evidence, these came over from the German-speaking areas of the north into England. They did fight back the Picts and others, but then they decided to stay, and they turned on their hosts, the Britons and the Romano-Celtic peoples. And by around 500 or so had taken over most of what is now England. But sometime after 500, according to various legends and according to various historical accounts, there was a leader who was of Roman ancestry, though he probably had Celtic blood as well through intermarriage, whose name in one of these accounts is given as Ambrosius Aurelianus, raised an army at a place which in the Latin historical account is called Mons Badonicus, or in English, Mount Badon, B-A-D-O-N, Mount Badon. This is in the early 500s. And at Mount Badon had a tremendous military victory against the Anglo-Saxon forces and established a truce so that about half of England at the time, roughly to the west and to the south, remained under their control, and the other half, mainly to the east and the north, remained under the control of the Anglo-Saxons. That continued to be true for somewhere like a half century, after which the Anglo-Saxons eventually overran those British and Romano-Celtic peoples and established their authority throughout what is now England, and even a little bit beyond to the north, into what is now Scotland. Now, that famous leader, that Ambrosius Aurelianus, who had raised that force that fought against the Anglo-Saxons, he became a great Celtic hero. Stories and songs about him continued for centuries among the Welsh. Remember now, the Welsh are Celtic people, right? And among the Irish also originally being a Celtic people. And those stories we can find, by the way, in ancient Welsh narratives, and we can find in ancient Irish narratives from the earlier Middle Ages, eventually apparently developed into the stories about King Arthur and the knights and ladies of the Round Table. That's what most scholars of early Celtic literature and of the Arthurian romances and the development of those romances, the early development of those romances, believe that they have sufficient evidence to prove. Which is a very interesting concept, by the way. And obviously, by the time that they emerge as Arthurian romances, they are going to be much changed. For example, now Arthur has become a king in England. He's no longer a Romano-Celtic leader, right? And those stories are going to become very fully developed by the 12th and 13th and 14th centuries. But that's still far in the future from the time that I'm talking about here. So in any event, Anglo-Saxon society develops. The Anglo-Saxons were not Christians. The Romans, at least many of the Romans, had been Christians, and many of the Celtic peoples had been Christians. It used to be thought by historians that the Anglo-Saxons, as not Christians, I hesitate to use the word pagan just because it carries derogatory connotations that we may not want here, but they were pagans or they were non-Christians. Their religious beliefs are very interesting. We're going to talk about those a little bit later on. But in any event, it used to be thought by historians that they wiped out Christianity. That's not really true, but they drove it largely underground, and there are certain pockets of Christianity that survived here and there. And then eventually, in the 6th century, the middle of the 6th century, the 500s, there were Christian missionaries who came over from Ireland into England and began to do Christian missionary work in the north of Britain. And then at the end of the 6th century, 597, a certain St. Augustine, this is not the great St. Augustine, the great church father, this is another St. Augustine, this is St. Augustine of Canterbury, was sent by Pope Gregory the Great to Britain to convert the peoples of Britain to Christianity. Now, apparently, Pope Gregory was not aware that already there were Irish missionaries in the north, because those Irish missionaries may not have been in contact with Rome at that time, even though Rome was sort of a center of Christianity. And so the Pope sent these southern Mediterranean monks, they were from the northern part of Italy, sent them to the southern part of England to convert the peoples of England to Christianity. The first place they went to was in Kent. And they went to the seat of the King of Kent, which was Canterbury. And they were able to convert the king largely because the king's wife was already a Christian herself. And so she played, obviously, an important role in the conversion of her husband. And so then the King of Kent turned over what archaeology now appears to have shown as an early pagan temple or shrine to Augustine and his Christian monks. And what they did was they redesigned it as a church, which became the church of St. Augustine, who now by the Pope had been named the bishop or archbishop, high bishop of Britain, or of England if you wish. which is why to this day the person who is, from an ecclesiastical point of view, the head of the Church of England, what over here is the Episcopal Church, generally speaking, but the head of the Church of England is the Archbishop of Canterbury. Right? Okay, so what's happening? Well, you've got this whole new culture coming into the North, which is a very interesting story in and of itself. You know, we used to look at the history of the growth of Christianity as after the early centuries, you know, in which there were the martyrdoms and, you know, throwing people to the lions in the Colosseum and all that sort of thing, that when things got settled down, and after the Edict of Milan in the early 4th century under the Emperor Constantine, it became legal to be a Christian and for Christianity to be legally recognized as a religion which one could freely practice in the Roman Empire. And then by the end of the 4th century, it actually had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, though not all at once. And of course, there were lots of people who never converted to Christianity, but many obviously did. Well, the same kind of thing was happening now in England, where you had these missionaries coming up from the south. They are engaging in missionary work and converting people along the way, some of which were mass conversions. And this did not affect everybody, or everybody all at once. Lots of people said, I don't want to be a Christian. I'm perfectly content with the old ways and with the old religion. For example, there's one case in which the Christian missionaries came to a particular king who was a North Germanic king, and said, well, you know, we would very much like for you to convert to Christianity. And said, well, that, you know, I've listened to your teaching, and this sounds like a wonderful religion, and I would be willing to embrace it. But I have one problem. If I don't become a Christian, does this mean that I will be condemned to hell? And apparently the missionary said to him, well, yes, people who are not baptized Christians, you know, they're not going to go to heaven. And the king is reported to have said, well, now, wait a minute, does that mean that all of my ancestors would not be able to go to heaven? That I'd go to heaven if I became a Christian, but all of my ancestors whom I honor would not be able to go to heaven? And they said, well, yeah, that's true. And so he said, I will not dishonor my ancestors by, in effect, betraying them by going off to an afterlife that they cannot participate in as well. So what I'm getting at is that there were a lot of people who resisted the spread of Christianity. I one time gave a series of lectures called Heathen Europe. You know, what was Heathen Europe like? How did they look upon the Christian missionaries who were coming from the south? Italians and people from what is now southern France, who had totally different mindset, totally different cultural values in many, many ways. And wanted to change not simply the gods that people worshipped, but wanted to change lots of other things about their culture, like whom you married, or under what conditions could you marry this person rather than that person. The imposition of a whole new sexual morality, which was totally foreign to the people of the North. Whole new attitudes towards women, which were totally foreign to the peoples of the North. I'm not trying to say that Northern Europe was a feminist paradise, but what I am saying is that among the peoples of the North, women held a much higher position of honor and of status than women in general did in the Mediterranean South. And I'm not talking about simply queens or people like that. I'm talking about ordinary women. And so as a consequence, attitudes towards women were much different. For example, women in general could choose whom they would marry. Women could choose to divorce. I mean, it's interesting, lots of cultures do not allow women the right of divorce. Men have the right of divorce, but women don't have the right of divorce. I mean, there are cultures today. I don't want to get into squabbles about these things here, but there are lots of cultures in which women do not have the right of divorce. Well, in the cultures of the North, women did. They even in the earliest law codes made provisions for child support. Who would have custody of the children, under what conditions, what kind of monetary support would be given to the parent who ended up with the custody of the children, and so forth. I mean, these things were done in very, very early times in the North. Well, this is all foreign stuff to these guys who are coming up from the South. First of all, they're mostly Italians, not all, but many of them are Italians, or they're Gauls, coming from Gaul at the time. They don't speak English. They sound like they have, these funny accents. They often have to speak to the people through translators, or only imperfectly using the language themselves. They wear these different kinds of clothing. They are single men who aren't marrying. Who are these people? And advocating, things like perpetual virginity as the ideal Christian life, and the peoples of the North are saying, you've got to be kidding. In general, the women of the North were very sexually liberated. And so these monks coming from the southern Mediterranean culture were horrified, not at the behavior of the men, but at the behavior of the women. I mean, you look at the literature and you can see this in the literature itself, but you can also see it in other kinds of historical accounts. I mean, women would simply go out and choose their partners. The sexual morality was a much more easygoing kind of thing than was customary for women in the Mediterranean South, where you could be stoned to death, for the same kinds of things that you might be honored for, in the North. So what I'm getting at here is that there were some real culture clashes along the way, and this was not a smooth or easy transition. But nevertheless, cultural change was taking place. And one of the things that we're going to see as we get into the literature is how these two different cultures are trying to accommodate themselves to one another. Pope Gregory the Great wrote to the successor of Augustine as Archbishop of Canterbury, actually 2 archbishops after Augustine, a certain bishop or Archbishop Mellitus. And he said, the best way to convert these peoples of the North is as much as possible to adapt their already existing beliefs and practices and holy places to Christian beliefs, practices, and holy places. And much of what happened in those early centuries, in the ways in which the peoples of the North and the peoples from the South were trying to accommodate themselves to one another in this new cultural development in places like England, though England was not alone in this, becomes the most interesting and important stuff in the literature, as we're going to see, even in such a great work as Beowulf. So, that's it for today.